Tensions between Russia and the United States are running high due to the conflict in Ukraine. A war of economic sorts is playing out publicly in the form of sanctions imposed by the West and retaliatory bans on U.S. and European products put into place by President Vladimir Putin. But what happens to the cooperation between Russia and the United States on nuclear issues? Over the last few years, the two countries have been working together behind the scenes to remove highly enriched uranium from Ukraine and other former Soviet republics. Congress is now considering a suspension of that partnership, and many warn that an end to nuclear collaboration could have dire consequences. Joining us today is former Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana, who spent an entire career working on nuclear nonproliferation and co-authored the Soviet Nuclear Threat Reduction Act of 1991, better known as the Nunn-Lugar Act. Senator, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
As I said, you have dedicated your career to really working on this issue. So what do you see as the most important and critical elements of our nuclear partnership with Russia?
Well, it all started with the Reykjavik meeting of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1986, in which President Reagan talked about no nuclear weapons, 10 years, a celebration after that. In fact, in that year, Sam Nunn, senator from Georgia, and I were among a congressional group that were asked by President Reagan to go to Geneva, Switzerland. And we met with Russians. The hope was that there would be the beginnings of nuclear disarmament negotiations, but that was not to happen. And in 1991, Sam Nunn and I, visiting with many of the Russians that we had been acquainted with from Geneva onward, went to the Congress with the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Act, which gave the president $400 million to spend working on the first elements of this cooperation. Now, this proceeded for 22 years, the Nunn-Lugar Act, through a whole host of situations in Congress, ups and downs with Russia and what have you, but an expansion of cooperation between the two countries. It came to a conclusion in about 2012. At that stage, why President Obama was preparing, at least in a campaign for more nuclear disarmament, and in fact in 2013, in a speech in Berlin, once again talked about no nukes over the course of a period of time. But I went to Russia and to Moscow in particular in 2012 in the summer to try to keep alive the Nunn-Lugar Act, a so-called umbrella clause, which allowed American personnel, both military and civilian, to continue working with Russians without having personal liability in the process. It was sort of the minimum, and unfortunately the War Office in Russia at that time said, we're tired of the whole business. The Foreign Office was more tolerant, said, we'll think about it. But think about it or not, it came to a conclusion in June of 2013. Sam Nunn and I were invited to the office of Rose Gadamer, Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, and the Russian ambassador, Mr. Cieslyak, was over there. And they signed a treaty which, in fact, was made formal by President Putin and President Obama in Berlin the following week. Sam Nunn and I both gave speeches recalling the 22 years of cooperation and hoping for more, but at the same time, the prospects were dimming, even as President Obama in his first year after his new inaugural talked once again, hopefully, about a world without nuclear weapons.
So, Senator, where do
yes.
you, let me just interrupt for a moment there. So where do you see things now? Do you think that things have gotten so bad that diplomatic relations have broken down so much between Russia and the United States that they are going to damage this key area of cooperation?
Yes, I think the damage has already occurred in many ways. And of course, we've had, in addition, the charges that the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, has been violated by Russians with a missile test. That treaty is in some jeopardy, although the United States is holding fast to the hope that we still have that one. But the fact is that the nuclear material that was coming over 500 metric tons of it to the United States from the former Soviet Union nuclear weapons, that ended in shipments to Baltimore last year. As a matter of fact, almost all of the elements of cooperation, the great scientific arrangement that was signed just a year ago or so that would allow scientists from Russia and the United States to go to each other's labs back and forth. Now, we still have the New START Treaty, and this calls for biannual meetings, or rather, inspection groups, coming from Russia to the United States and vice versa. But there's not much there at this point, and the United States, as a matter of fact, is really uncertain from time to time as to what kind of cooperation we might have. We have at least something still going in terms of the space program, and we're hopeful that will not be shut down.
Well, let's talk about the New START Treaty. One of the things that happened when President Obama first took office is that there were many questions about his foreign policy credentials, his lack of experience and expertise there. And so signing a New START Treaty, this updated arms control agreement with Russia, was a big deal, one of his few foreign policy successes at the time. And I just want to take a look at the president's optimism then in 2010.
Since I took office, I've been committed to a reset of our relationship with Russia. When the United States and Russia can cooperate effectively, it advances the mutual interests of our two nations and the security and prosperity of the wider world. And today, we have reached agreement on one of my administration's top national security priorities, a pivotal new arms control agreement. In many ways, nuclear weapons represent both the darkest days of the Cold War and the most troubling threats of our time. Today, we've taken another step forward in leaving behind the legacy of the 20th century while building a more secure future for our children.
Now, Senator, you worked closely with the president on this, and he sure faced a lot of opposition, a lot of partisan opposition. So 4 years later, how do you think he's done on the issues? You mentioned a lot of the areas of cooperation are now no longer intact.
Well, the New START Treaty was a modest treaty. It would limit the warheads down to 1,550 each of Russia and the United States. The Russians are already below the 1,550 level. We're not far behind that. The fact is that there was informal conversation, at least among some leaders in Congress and the administration, at the beginning of 2013, as to whether perhaps there might be another agreement between Russia and the United States to go down to maybe 1,000 nuclear warheads each. There was agreement at that meeting, and I remember vividly, that the Congress would not agree to this, that the New START Treaty at that point was about the last point in which we were going to be able to get a two-thirds majority. And that was at the beginning of the Obama administration. Now, that hasn't changed subsequently. And the last appropriation fight in the Congress was one that might have severely limited what we could do under the New START Treaty, although that was mitigated somewhat by the time it came to conclusion. But it's a very hostile mood, and the feeling on many in Congress is reciprocated by Vladimir Putin, for example, who pointed out, don't tread on Russia. We still have nuclear weapons. We may not have conventional forces of the size we had before, but nevertheless, we do have nuclear weapons, and we will use them in our self-defense, even against conventional forces that might come against us.
So do you think that either Russia or the United States would use those weapons now, anytime soon?
No, I don't believe so. I think, we were spared 40 years of so-called mutually assured destruction at a time that there were huge arsenals aimed at all of our major military installations, both sides, and at all of our major cities. When I was serving as mayor of Indianapolis for 8 years, I was unaware that my city was probably targeted, and one or two of those weapons might have annihilated the whole city. That was true of all major cities in America at that time. Somehow we were spared an accident or some terrible sortie that went beyond the bounds of the leadership. And we've reduced that threat, reduced it very materially. But at the same time, Russia holds the weapons in terms of its defense. We have a similar amount because essentially we believe that this is necessary to withstand the Russian threat or the threats of others that might rise. We have no idea. As we take a look at the development of nuclear weapons in North Korea or we're negotiating now, and we do have at least the cooperation of the Russians in dealing with Iran, we believe. Well, hopefully it will forestall that program. There are nuclear weapons in India and Pakistan. There are great dangers there, as a matter of fact. For all of these reasons, we are likely to keep a supply, and the debate in Congress will be how much are we doing to renew or refurbish the situation? What is the backlog in terms of our maintenance?
And Senator, how much do you think that individual leaders come into play here? The relationship between President Obama and Vladimir Putin, if you can really say that there is one. Let's say that Putin falls, that he loses power. This is something that now people are bringing up. If there is enough resentment within the country over the economic damage that's being done thanks to sanctions that are being imposed by the West, then what happens to this relationship and this cooperation?
Well, we've been through different leaders in Russia and the United States. The need for the cooperation will still be essential in my judgment, and new leaders will arise that see that necessity and are able to be persuasive with their own countrymen, quite apart from in a bilateral way. This is really imperative with regard to the safety of the whole world. We're just simply in a predicament presently in which we hoped for better cooperation with Russia to keep mopping up the elements of weapons of mass destruction or nuclear fissile material or so forth that are still left in many countries. We were making good progress on this prior to the breakdown of situation in the past year. I hope we'll be able to renew that.
All right, Senator. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And if
Thank you
care to stick around, we're going to bring in a few other guests too. And we certainly invite you to join us. So now let's bring in a few more of those guests to expand this conversation. I'd like to welcome Matthew Bunn. He's a professor of practice at Harvard University. William Tobey, senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and Joseph Cirincione, the president of the Plowshares Fund. So thank you all for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
So I want to start with a report that was recently released with collaboration with the Department of Energy, and it warned that the United States and Russia have to work together for international nuclear safety. Here's a line from it. It says, effective nuclear security for all stockpiles worldwide will be almost impossible to achieve without Russia and the United States working together on improving and sustaining nuclear security in their own countries, helping other countries improve their nuclear security, and strengthening the global nuclear security framework. So Matthew, you helped write this report. Why do you see our cooperation as so essential?
Well, the reality is that we've made enormous improvements in the security for nuclear materials in Russia and in many other countries around the world. You no longer have in Russia places where there are gaping holes in fences or no detector at all to set off an alarm when someone's carrying plutonium out in their briefcase. But nuclear security in Russia still has some vulnerabilities that a sophisticated conspiracy might be able to exploit. So there's more to be done, and it's in the vital interest of the United States to make sure that work does get done. So this cooperation is not something we do as a favor to Russia. It's something that we do as an investment in our own security.
And so, Joe, I mean, let's talk about one of the things we brought up at the beginning of this discussion today was that Russia and the United States were working together for a couple of years to bring nuclear materials, weapons-grade nuclear materials, out of Ukraine, where obviously currently we see a civil conflict. Where else, are some of these nuclear materials that we most worry about?
Well, it's an excellent example. However terrible the situation is in Ukraine, it is not a nuclear crisis now, and that's because the U.S. and Russia and other countries cooperated to get rid of 1,000 nuclear weapons that were in Ukraine until 1994, and then tons of material that could be used to build a bomb. The rebels cannot get their hands on that anymore because it's not in the country. We did a similar effort with Kazakhstan and with Belarus, eliminating nuclear weapons, eliminating nuclear materials, and some of the materials in other countries around the world are of Russian origin, so we've been cooperating with Russia to make sure that we get it back to Russia where it can be down-blended, so we can't use it for weapons, or at least more securely stored than in some of these more fragile nations.
And, as the Senator Lugar pointed out earlier, too, despite the fact that there are treaties, that there are agreements between the two countries on this, it doesn't mean that everyone always does their part. There was a 2010 State Department report on arms control compliance that said that Russia didn't fully obey all of the terms of the New START treaty. And it read, notwithstanding the overall success of START implementation, a number of long-standing compliance issues that were raised in the START Treaty's Joint Compliance and Inspection Commission remained unresolved when the treaty expired on December 5th, 2009. William, let's just talk practically how these things actually work. When there is a treaty, an agreement between two countries like this, who enforces it? Who makes sure that countries comply? What happens if they don't?
Well, the answer to your question is that there is no outside party that can enforce such treaties. It's a matter of negotiation between the two parties to the treaty, and there are compliance groups that are established to meet regularly to discuss those issues. But I think it's also important that we try to, as much as possible, separate the two issues, arms control and nuclear security. I realize they both involve nuclear weapons, but with respect to nuclear security, both the United States and Russia have very clear interest, without any competitive impulse pertaining to the problem, to make sure that this material doesn't fall into the hands of terrorists. And therefore, I would argue that despite tensions in, for example, Ukraine, and difficulties over the Russian violation of the INF Treaty, the cooperative work on nuclear security should continue.
And so is this something, Joe, that you see, despite the fact that we have this real breakdown in diplomatic relations currently ongoing, is this something that the two countries can pinpoint and isolate and still work on together, despite the fact that, if all economic cooperation breaks down, if diplomatic cooperation breaks down in other areas, can nuclear security still be an outlier?
Yes. And it is an area where we are continuing to cooperate. You may have seen that there was an effort to expand the cooperation, to involve the nuclear labs even more fully in this, both in Russia and the United States. And that's been put on hold, regrettably, by the chill in relations. But still, the core relationship between the United States on securing these nuclear materials around the world continues, as does U.S. and Russian cooperation with Iran. What the crisis in Ukraine hasn't affected the negotiations with Iran because it's in both countries' interests to make sure Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, both the U.S. and Russia. So we have to ensure that kind of cooperation continues. There are core vital areas like nuclear security, like space cooperation. We depend on the Russians to get our astronauts to the International Space Station. These kinds of core efforts have to continue despite the crisis in Ukraine.
And so, William, do you see them being able to continue? We're talking about the necessity of that and how vitally important it is. But is there any situation that you see that's currently brewing out of what we see happening in Ukraine and the tension that's growing over that could lead for any of that to break down?
It's a tricky problem. The Russian central government has shown greater reluctance to continue this cooperation of late over the last year or so. And I would imagine that if relations continue to sour because of the annexation of Crimea and the threat to Ukraine, Moscow will perhaps be even less inclined to carry out such cooperation. At the same time, at the local level, it's clear that the laboratories and sites where Americans and Russians have worked together, they'd like to continue this work. And it is vital to both Russian and U.S. security.
So, Matthew, what do you see perhaps as the single most important area of our cooperation and collaboration here? Is there one thing when we keep talking about nuclear security and the difference between perhaps nuclear armament? That's something that William pointed out. Is there any other place, I asked this earlier too, that you really think should be on the sites of these two countries, aside from Ukraine, aside from Iran? Where else are the materials that we should be worried about?
Well, it's important to understand that nuclear security is not just a Russia problem. It is a global problem. There are materials that could be used to make a nuclear bomb in some 24 countries around the world in varying amounts. But Russia has the world's largest stockpile of both nuclear weapons and nuclear materials. We're second in both of those categories. And so our countries really need to work together we have more experience than anyone in guarding these materials. We have more materials to guard. Many of the materials in other countries came from us, and when we want to remove them, they come back to us. So if you look, for example, at President Obama's 4-year effort to secure nuclear material around the world, which did make very substantial progress, though there's more work to be done, you find that there were more than a dozen countries that eliminated all of the weapons usable material on their soil. So there's nothing there for terrorists to get anymore. But 7 of those, the material went to Russia. If we hadn't been cooperating with Russia, we wouldn't have been able to clean out those 7 countries. We've got at least 2 or 3 more we want to do, but that would need to send their material to Russia by the next Nuclear Security Summit in 2016. So I really believe we need to work hard to rebuild the cooperation at the site level that Will was talking about as we move toward that nuclear security summit and try to get a little more understanding at the political level as well.
But do we have that dedication on the political level even at home? If you look at what President Obama has been doing, we played the clip earlier there of signing the New START treaty. This was seen as a huge foreign policy success story, and this seemed like it would be one of the crowning and defining achievements of his administration. And yet, if you look at where the numbers are recently, in just March, there's the Hague Nuclear Security Summit, and the president came up with a proposal to significantly cut nuclear security assistance spending by some 25%. How should we interpret that, Joe?
You've really put your finger on something. You've got this top-level commitment from the president, the vice president, secretary of state, secretary of defense. But when you get down to the money, well, now the bureaucracy is keeping its grip. And it has chosen, and this is some of the people that the president, frankly, has appointed to take the money away from nuclear security and put it towards nuclear weapons production. Now, there is a need to modernize our nuclear weapons production facility, but not at the cost of securing these materials and weapons around the world. I think the administration has taken its eye off the ball here, has let its lower-level mid-management people make decisions that run contrary to the president's own vision. I'm hopeful that the president, after the midterm elections, will turn back to this issue and reassert the leadership he once enjoyed on it. There's a lot left to do. He's got 2 more years. I hope he gets to it.
William, do you agree? Has he dropped the ball?
Well, I was very surprised that they sent him off to the Hague Nuclear Security Summit with a budget proposal that cut spending in this area by, as you said, roughly 25%. It made no sense, and it resulted in either delaying or, in some cases, even essentially not doing some important work.
How much of that is bureaucratic and mid-level management issues, as Joe just pointed out there, and how much of that is a fear of what perhaps Republicans might say, right? I mean, let's not forget there is still domestic opposition here. There are still those who advocate for building up our own nuclear arsenal, for constantly needing to renew, reinvent it, and for wanting to really go it alone.
Well, both the money involved at modernizing our nuclear weapons facilities and nuclear security are very small fractions of the total defense budget. We can afford to do both, but the president needs to make some hard choices. And unfortunately, he seems not to have done that. His administration did make commitments to modernize our nuclear weapons facilities as a part of the negotiations that ended up passing the New START treaty. And I think they're to be applauded in keeping those commitments. But that doesn't mean we need to cut nuclear security. I mean, for example, the budget there is a small fraction of the total defense budget, less than 1%.
That said, it's not always all about the numbers too, right? It's about how you're actually using the resources and the money. I've got a comment here from Darnell who says, was all of the funding necessary? Matthew, are we just not using the money wisely or properly?
I actually think that we've used this money in a remarkable way. Nobody can say every penny went to exactly where it should have gone, but if you look at the amount of money spent and the amount of progress made, I think we got more increase in our security per dollar spent from these programs locking down nuclear material than we get from practically anywhere else in the U.S. government budget. We know for a fact that Al-Qaeda has been attempting to get nuclear weapons and the materials needed to make them and the expertise to put those materials into a crude bomb for decades. And they appear to have failed so far. And I think one of the reasons is that we've been successful in locking down these nuclear materials. We need to finish the job. It's something we're going to have to keep working on for a long time to come.
Yeah. Can I just add to that? Matt makes a very important point. We've been warning about the threat of nuclear terrorism for years. It hasn't happened. So you say, oh, this is a bunch of Cassandras. What do they know? They're overhyping the threat. No. The reason there hasn't been a nuclear terrorist incident is because of government policies that, as Matthew says, did something about it, tightened the material, eliminated the material, as well as went after the terrorist groups themselves. So this is solid government policy. Almost every dime on nuclear security is well spent. It prevents a nuclear 9/11.
All right, I'm going to have to leave it there. But Matthew, William, and Joe, thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, guys, stick around. There's much more coming up on HuffPost Live.